We went to high school together, and he's an anesthesiologist and addiction medicine specialist, board certified in both areas, and he practices here in Orange County. The goal here today is just to have an open dialogue so that people have an opportunity to hear from a trusted expert in the field. Today's discussion is so important because more and more we're reading about opioid overdoses in younger people, and we all likely have someone who's in our lives who's battled or continues to battle through recovery. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've heard of a couple of celebrities who have succumbed to their drug addiction. One was Logan Williams, who's the 16-year-old actor from The Flash. He died of a fentanyl overdose. And from my conversations with Dr. Dahimi, fentanyl is increasingly responsible for overdoses because it's 50 to 100 times more potent than even heroin. So if you can just wrap your brain around that, it's super scary. And it's being laced into all types of drugs, including, cannabis and lots of different things, and being pressed into fake Xanax bars, etc. And then Melissa Etheridge's son also died, I believe it was last week, of a drug overdose. I think he was in his early 20s. So what I'd love to do now is just to introduce Dr. Dahimi. Hi, David. He and I went to high school together, as I said. He's a board-certified anesthesiologist and addiction medicine specialist. He practices in Orange County and works with numerous rehab facilities and has worked with numerous facilities throughout all of Orange County. So David, if you wouldn't mind, just give a little introduction and background.
Yeah, hi, my name is David Dahimi, and as Nish said, we were high school friends. And then after a long period of time, we hooked up again, and we've been kind of chatting on addiction-related topics. And she thought it would be a really good idea to do sort of more of a adolescent parent prevention kind of talk. Most of these I do are typically for people who already have substance use disorders and they're wanting to get a better understanding of what treatment options are, or parents of kids that have substance use disorders who have failed traditional treatment. So this is a little bit of a shift, and I really like this idea because prevention is huge, and with the adolescent population in particular, prevention is everything. So we'll talk a bit about that. As she mentioned, I'm an anesthesiologist here in Orange County. I practice at Saddleback Memorial. Prior to that, I was a psychology major at UC San Diego, but my psychology degree was much more along the lines of physiologic psychology. And that's where I first got introduced to concepts of addiction and how the brain rewires when it's exposed to drugs and alcohol and changes that are reversible versus permanent. So I was kind of interested in this sort of stuff way back as an undergraduate. And then went to medical school and anesthesiology, became an anesthesiologist as my full-time specialty. I liked it so much, I stayed on for an extra year and a half doing cardiovascular and thoracic anesthesiology. I did a fellowship. And then I got into private practice here and, did the private practice thing for about 3 or 4 years before I started to become bored. And that's when I started to look for other things to do as well, and just stumbled upon addiction medicine one day. And for various reasons I think we'll talk about, it really resonated with me. So now I spend about half my time practicing addiction medicine and half my time still practicing anesthesiology.
Well, thank you. I know that I'm sure your patients from both sides of the fence, whether it's cardiothoracic anesthesiology patients or your addiction medicine patients, are very appreciative of your expertise and just your passion for what you do. So thank you. Also, just a note to anyone in our audience, if you have any questions, just put it in the chat. You can either send it directly to, if you want to send it to the entire group, or you can send it directly to me if you would like to. Am I listed on there? I think I'm listed on there. So you can just do that, one of the hosts, so that we can see your questions. That would be great. All right, so this discussion is broken up into 3 parts. The first part is just really the overview, the growing problem, the stats and facts. The statistics are super scary. They can be very concerning. Cigarette and alcohol use is still the #1 non-illicit, what we consider gateway drugs. Cannabis use, which is the #1 illicit abused drug, high potency, etc., is really becoming, coming into the spotlight. We'll talk about that as well. And then overdoses, are more and more highlighted and in the news. Fentanyl is everywhere. California is really seeing a spike. The second part of our discussion is what makes adolescence different. What is it about the brain development and sort of the physiology of kids that really makes them more susceptible? And then the third part we're going to get into is the protection and the preventive factors. So David, first question for you, for those of us who live in Orange County, I know we have people who are tuning in from around the country, but in Orange County, isn't it true that we are the #1 county in the country for rehab facilities per capita?
Yeah, we're either #1 or #2. Sometimes Florida competes with us for that distinction, but for all intents and purposes, for as long as I can remember, we've been #1. We have something like, last time I looked, over 800 drug and alcohol treatment facilities in Orange County alone.
And why is that? Why do we have such a high per capita?
It's multifactorial, but one of the main reasons is that drug and alcohol treatment programs that are located in coastal communities can attract people much more easily from all around the country. Part of their marketing has to do with, like, come to treatment by the beach and, we'll put you up in a real nice spot. I mean, you've seen some of the places like in Malibu, $70,000 a month for exclusive ocean view, like passages and promises and stuff like that. And so that appeals to a lot of people. They know they have a problem and they're like, well, I might as well go somewhere nice to be treated. And then it just grew out of that.
Interesting. And so my background is actually in software and marketing. So I would imagine that they do a lot of, search engine optimization, and they do a lot of keyword buying. And so it's sort of this, it's the business behind running a rehab center because you want to fill the beds. Is that correct?
Oh, tons of marketing goes into this. And the more appealing the marketing, the better.
Right.
And then I also failed to mention that a lot of people that came here for treatment essentially just stayed for various reasons. And some of them ended up opening up their own drug and alcohol treatment programs. There's more than a few that are owned and operated by people that formerly came for treatment themselves. So, and then patients, part of the way it works is they're brought in from all over the country, on their parents' PPO insurance plans, and they're given basically a flight out here and a place to stay, and all their needs are met. And then when their insurance benefits kind of run out, or say they're done with that episode of treatment, they'd rather be here than go back to, wherever it is that they're from. So part of our big homeless population actually is resulted from that.
Right. I remember talking to you about that. The whole Anaheim River situation was probably a lot of people who.
Yeah, it's absolutely part of many of those people were brought here from other states.
Right. Okay. And so addiction can come in many forms, right? Not just alcohol, not just drugs. What else are you seeing?
Yeah, well, I mean, addiction gambling use disorder. There are sex addictions. Increasingly, gaming is becoming an addiction. I don't think gaming.
So video gaming.
Yeah, exactly. Video gaming. I don't think it's made it into the DSM yet, but I bet you it will, because it shares a lot of features with other addictions. What we primarily treat by far and away are substance use disorders, that's the sort of more, that's the term that we use for addiction in the treatment community. So I'll use substance use disorder and addiction interchangeably. But yeah, we treat chemical substance dependency.
Okay. And so addiction changes brain chemistry, is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of the basis for what an addiction is. The brain chemistry changes, and as a result, behaviors change, and drugs are reinforcing, or that's the word for addictive, reinforcing, because they produce a lot of dopamine within certain parts of the brain, which is pleasurable or euphoric. And the brain begins to change in response to those high levels of dopamine by compensating. So what the brain does is it makes it harder and harder to produce that amount of dopamine. So what happens then is that it takes increasingly more and more of the drug of choice to produce the same level of effect. And then a secondary thing occurs in which that you develop tolerance, and withdrawal starts to become a factor. So when you take away this constant exposure to these substances, now you have a lack of dopamine in certain parts of your brain, and that's associated with dysphoria, being very uncomfortable. Certain drugs have intense physiologic manifestations of withdrawal, like opiate withdrawal is characterized as like heavy flu-like symptoms. These are all due to brain changes that are occurring like on the molecular level, and has to do with alterations in the neurotransmitters. And the primary one is dopamine.
Okay, wow. So if we could run through a couple of stats here. I know that we had discussed some of these, but if you wouldn't mind just giving our listeners an understanding of, you know, how many people in the US are affected by substance use disorder.
Yeah, so we'll come back to, by the way, we're going to use THC and fentanyl as some of the extreme examples, I hope, again, with adolescents. But in regards to some of the epidemiologic statistics in the United States, there's about 22 million, 23 million people that have a diagnosed substance use disorder in the United States. Alcohol is by far and away the biggest one, but the most deadly one is opiate use disorder. And over the past approximately 10 years, opiate use disorder has become, deaths from opiate use disorder in terms of overdoses have become the #1 accidental cause of death in the United States, especially for people under the age of 50. Forever beforehand, it was car accidents. But opiates have not only replaced that, they've basically greatly surpassed it. And I'm going to pop up a real quick picture here just to give you an idea. This is sort of from the CDC, but we've adopted it. I forgot to mention I'm the medical director of my MAT clinic. That's the name of our clinic, which is basically a doctor's office that specializes in addiction treatment. And we'll talk more about what types of medications we use. But here's a graph of what the curve looks like. And 2017 ended up being a peak year in the United States for overdose deaths at around 73,000. In 2018, it came down slightly in most of the US, but actually increased even more in California. And that was because fentanyl is particularly prevalent here in California. And fentanyl, as Mish already mentioned once, is responsible for, increasingly responsible for deaths. 19,000 fatalities due to fentanyl in 2016, and that's probably an underestimation. So anyways, this gives you an idea of how fast this problem is growing and how deadly it actually is. So, and then a couple other stats. Cocaine and methamphetamine are involved in overdose deaths in addition to opiates a substantial amount of the time. So people who use drugs often don't just use one, they use several in combination. ER visits, by far and away, most are due to opiates and stimulants overdoses. So those are some statistics. What else?
Can you
Do you want me to jump on the adolescent statistics?
Yes, if we can talk about the high school statistics that you know.
Yeah, I went and looked up a few of them from some of the past courses I've taken. Anyways, by senior year of high school, 70% of seniors will have tried alcohol, 50% will have taken an illicit drug, 40% will have smoked, and greater than 20% will be using a prescription drug for non-medical purposes. And with the legalization of marijuana, come big problems that we'll talk about in a minute, but I expect those numbers to get a lot worse. In 2013, and I don't know, I don't have newer data on this, but something like close to 40% of high school seniors had smoked marijuana that very year. And I think it's about 10% do it habitually.
Wow, okay. So I'm going to take a moment right now just to launch a quick one-question poll, and that is just, do you or loved ones suffer from substance use disorder? I'm just going to launch that so that we can see, you know, of those who have logged in. I think we have about 17 people here, just what the percentages are. So I'm going to leave that up for a little bit. All right, so let's go into the second part of the discussion, which is what makes adolescence different. So given that kids' brains continue to develop into their mid-20s, can you share what you know about substance use disorder and the age at which people begin experimenting?
Um, well, the age varies, is highly variable depending on a number of environmental factors. But prior to that, we should talk about, so what is it about adolescents that makes them so unique and puts them especially at a high level of risk? So there's a confluence of sort of factors, which are genetic factors, environmental factors, and parenting attitudes, and then community attitudes and peer attitudes. These things all kind of go together to create risk for the individual. And what's so unique about adolescents' brains is it's the perfect setup for developing an addiction, because the part of the brain that's responsible for novelty and seeking new experiences is fully developed and extremely attuned to going after new experiences, because that's how learning happens. And as we know, kids' brains are capable of assimilating a tremendous amount of information rather quickly. They're sponges, right? Well, that also can work against them in terms of addiction. So the parts of the brain that are novel seeking are fully developed, and this is where reward centers are and the motivation centers of the brain. However, the part of your brain that sort of weighs risks and weighs consequences, which is called the prefrontal cortex, it's the front part of the brain here, has direct connections between that part of the brain that's seeking experiences, but it's not fully developed until your mid-20s in most people, boys a little bit later. So here you have the perfect problem where you got novel risk-taking behavior, but you don't have the brakes on that. So without the prefrontal cortex not being fully developed, what you get is a lot of trying of things without thinking at all about what could happen. And that is what we all worry about and why parents tune into these kinds of things.
Right. So it seems like then the earlier a person starts, the more risk they have later in life.
Yeah, that's one of the huge takeaways. If you take anything away, the earlier kids experiment with addictive substances, the more likely it is that they'll develop a substance use disorder. 9 out of 10 people who are adults with substance use disorders started trying things before the age of 18. And one of the other things, and if kids are trying drugs before the age of 18, they're 6.5 times more likely to develop a substance use disorder by the age of 21. So,
And what's the percentage of adolescents receiving treatment? I mean,
yeah, that's an interesting stat as well. So it's about 10% or less. So a lot of kids that have actual addictions don't go unnoticed and or don't receive proper treatment.
wow. Okay. And so that's why this discussion is so important. And if I may, I'm just going to quickly share the results of the poll. We have 77% of those who've tuned in and who took this poll said they have a loved one who suffers from substance use disorder, or they themselves suffer from it. So that's a huge number. And that's why this discussion is so important. All right, so let's go deeper on the teen brain development. What can we know about that? So I know you spoke about the prefrontal cortex. Is there anything else we should know about that, or do you feel that you've covered it all?
Well, that's the gist of it, is that you have the part that's thrill-seeking and novel experience-seeking fully developed, but the part that weighs consequences not developed until the 20s. And then if you combine that with sort of attitudes towards drugs, you know, the marijuana industry or cannabis industry, or is the more correct term, just like the tobacco industry, will employ the exact same types of marketing tactics, including making it appear that it's not that harmful, making it appear that it's really, really fun. And they're absolutely going after creating a habit in the younger population because that's good for business. It's no different than the vape makers, you know, adding cotton candy flavored vape oils to vape cartridges, or you know, marketing exactly the same types of candy sort of tactics or branding that the cigarette companies did with Joe Camel and back in the 60s and 70s. So the attitudes towards the marijuana too are just becoming much more of a sort of, well, it's legal now, so that must mean that there's no harm involved.
Right.
And so this again is a problem for kids because their friends are going to be using and they're going to be like, it's not a big deal. And so it downplays the risks associated with an actually very powerful chemical.
Yeah, that's definitely scary. And then add on top of that, we have, especially in pockets of the country where athletics is such a big part of our culture. And here, kids at a younger and younger age are choosing single sports, and then they're getting injured because their bones aren't totally developed. So they're getting injuries. Then they go into surgery, and, what we know is substance use disorder is non-discriminating. So I'd love if you could sort of dive into this a little bit more, because even coming out of having your wisdom teeth pulled, the dentist is writing you prescription for over prescribing, it seems.
Yeah. So, and there's some resources that we'll refer to at the end. There's a couple of books on how America became this sort of, has this opiate epidemic. One's called Dope Sick and the other one's called Dreamland. And they're great books to show sort of the sort of intersection of factors that resulted in us ending up with this giant epidemic, which is the opiate epidemic. But part of this had to do with Purdue Pharma and the marketing of OxyContin. I remember as being an anesthesia resident, all of a sudden there was this big push to make pain the fifth vital sign. And basically the drug companies convinced doctors using a couple of really small studies to said that, oh, well, if you treat pain and, people won't develop an addiction to the pain meds. And so they, for whatever reason, they were able to get a lot of traction with this sort of marketing campaign. And they basically had doctors like myself feel like we were absolutely under treating pain. And so we always were taught that, like, no, you give a small amount of pain medicines because people become addicted. And they're like, oh, no, that's not the case. We're really under treating pain. We need to be giving out a lot more pain medicines. Otherwise, we're not good doctors. So all of a sudden overnight, there were like we were required for licensing to get this kind of training. And so doctors started just prescribing a lot more pain medications. And as an anesthesiologist, I see it all the time. People will have a relatively minor outpatient surgery and get 30 Percocet with one refill. And that just came because those surgeons were basically taught to just give a bunch of opiates. And that in part led to the opiate epidemic that we're now looking at. And people do get hurt. I would say that probably half the people that we have in our clinic, it wasn't like they went to go get high the first time that they came across drugs. A lot of them were prescribed drugs to treat broken bones and injuries. And because they had a susceptibility to becoming, addicted, they did. And I mean, you wouldn't believe how many of our patients, if you listen to their stories, it all began with an injury.
Wow. And of course, our younger population they're unaware of the dangers, right? They don't know unless we have these conversations with them.
No, they absolutely don't know. And this is why when we get to the last part of this talk, we'll talk about like having open dialogue with your kids is one of the most important things you can do. If they're unaware of the risks associated with casual drug and substance use, then their chances of making a mistake are much higher. Because again, they're novel, they're seeking to have new experiences, and their peers will absolutely provide those new experiences for them. They just have to be armed with knowledge in order to make good choices.
Right. So we have a stat from 2015 on heroin use. Can you share that with the listeners?
A stat from 2015?
I think it's the adolescent opioid use, just the continued rise.
I don't know which one you're referring to.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll just give the audience the answer. It's 21,000 in 2015. Oh. Yeah, so that number continues to rise. We don't have any more recent stats, but 21,000, what's that number exactly?
21,000 was the number of active heroin users who were adolescents in 2015.
Okay.
So what happens is when you start with pain pills and you no longer have access to pain pills, but you have a serious opiate addiction, heroin is everywhere. And again, these books detail how that came to be, but in a nutshell, the Mexican drug cartels were able to provide large quantities of very inexpensive black tar heroin, and it spread across the United States like wildfire because it was much cheaper than getting OxyContins. And then when the supply of OxyContins dried up, and you're addicted, what are your choices? You're either gonna go into severe withdrawal, or you're gonna find something to replace the pills that you were once using. And that's where the heroin epidemic came from. And then not that many years ago, fentanyl started appearing in our drug supply. And because it's about 50 times, at least 50 times more potent than heroin, the overdose deaths just shot up dramatically. And the reason fentanyl is in our drug supply, it's all about making more money. If drug suppliers can take an existing drug and make it more potent and more addictive, then they can basically hook more people and get more customers. And that's the goal of adding heroin. And so now they're putting it in methamphetamine. They're pressing Xanax bars made out of fentanyl instead of Xanax. And it's turning up absolutely everywhere. And nobody knows how much they put in. So that's the sort of Russian roulette piece of this, is that you may be getting your same drug from the same dealer, and then one day there might be slightly more heroin and you're dead like that. And that's the problem with heroin.
Right.
I'm sorry, with fentanyl being in the heroin.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and so I know at the beginning of this discussion, we talked about brain chemistry changing. So based on your experience and the data that you have seen, how long does a craving last for someone who has substance use disorder?
So cravings, essentially the longer you use and the more potent the illicit drug, or even illicit drug in the case of alcohol, the longer the chronic exposure is, and the increased frequency will result in faster and more long-lasting brain changes. And the main one that we deal with all the time is tolerance and withdrawal and cravings. So tolerance and withdrawal result from increasing amounts of exposure, and cravings are the constant preoccupation with making sure that you get your next drug to avoid withdrawal. So for our patients, it's all about treating the cravings, because if you spend essentially all of your waking hours every day thinking about how you're not going to go into withdrawal and how you're going to get your next fix no matter what it takes, then you're not going to engage in any type of behavior that is going to be beneficial to your recovery, right? So we have to stabilize these behaviors, and at the root of those behaviors are cravings.
Interesting. Okay. So, all right, so let's shift gears a little bit. We're going to go into the next section, which is the protection and prevention. I know you've worked with a lot of rehab facilities here in Orange County. What have your experiences been?
They are okay, so I've worked for over 20 drug and alcohol treatment programs, and I currently work for 4 or 5. And I can tell you that a lot of them don't provide anything that amounts to evidence-based care whatsoever. The drug and alcohol treatment industry has always been based upon the tenets of the AA, which is Alcoholics Anonymous, and then from there they repurposed it to Narcotics Anonymous. And these are not unimportant, helpful organizations, but they're predicated on total abstinence and finding a higher power. And although there is some decent data to show that there are real good things they do for certain populations of people, especially for alcoholics, for opiate use disorder, they fail miserably more often than not. So 90 to 95% of people that go into an abstinence-based drug and alcohol treatment program will have relapsed by year's end. And something like 60 to 80% of them will relapse within 1 month of being in a 30 or 60-day residential program, because abstinence doesn't do anything for cravings, and it doesn't do anything for stress. And so the moment that you get out of this sort of structured living environment and you're faced with all of the same stressors that you had prior to going in, whether they be legal, social, not having a place to live, not having transportation, financial, usually your life is quite chaotic, and there's a lot of wreckage that's waiting for you once you get out. And so almost immediately, your friendly neighborhood drug dealer knows that you're out and starts ringing you up, or your friends are ringing you up, and you have all this sort of stuff going on in your head, and so you relapse like that. The problem with those relapses is now you're basically opiate naive. When you've been in the programs and you're not on any kind of maintenance medication, your opiate receptors are primed and naive. And quite often people overdose and die immediately following a treatment stint because of that the reason. They're at extremely high risk for overdose, given the fact that they've been abstinent for 30 or 60 days.
And so it seems like, I mean, if this analogy even works, but it's sort of like once you realize, or once you have been diagnosed as a diabetic, you need to continue on with some sort of treatment program with medication. Otherwise, right? Because your brain chemistry has now changed.
So real quick before I leave the treatment industry thing, I want to say they're not universally bad. There are some fantastic programs we work with, and what is good about treatment programs is they provide the behavioral side of treatment that's really important. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So what you're saying is you want me to talk about how addiction is a chronic disease. So yes, just like diabetes, addiction is a chronic disease of the brain, which shares a lot of similar features with other chronic diseases in terms of periods where you're doing better, periods where you're doing worse, and we call those relapses or slips in addiction. There is an underlying physiologic and biological process that underpins the disease. So just like diabetes, you're not making insulin, or you have insulin resistance. With addiction, as we've already talked about, you have brain changes that occur within parts of your brain responsible for producing motivation and reward. And just like other diseases, we have fantastically effective treatments in terms of medications that are vastly underutilized. That's where they differ. So in diabetes, medicines are highly utilized, and in addiction treatment, they're vastly underutilized. And one of the reasons for that is drug and alcohol treatment programs are most of them are pretty anti-medications, because again, they're founded on the tenets of AA and NA, which is like, oh no meds, you gotta basically find a higher power and a different belief system. That's why you're addicted, because you morally aren't strong enough to find a higher power. And I hear things all the time like, when somebody relapses, well, he just wasn't ready, or he just didn't hit rock bottom, or when rock bottom is an overdose and a death, I think that's a ridiculous sort of analogy. So what we promote is evidence-based treatment through the use of medications to treat cravings, to prevent relapse, to lessen the severity of relapse, and to prevent death, essentially. So when you've done all of these things and you have somebody stabilized on these medications, and they're not thinking about 500 times a day about like, how do I not go into withdrawal, then they're much more primed and ready to engage in the behavioral and psychosocial treatments that are necessary to create real lasting change. And some of these treatment programs, they're great at providing that piece, but they're bad at providing the medication piece that's so valuable.
Right. All right. So it seems like, I mean, there's a lot wrapped up in all of that, right? We could probably spend 3 hours going down that rabbit hole. So maybe we'll have to have another discussion around all of that. But let's just continue on. What are the youngest patients that come to you to seek help? I presume it's with the help of their parents, et cetera. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, interestingly, we don't get a lot of adolescents, seeking treatment. I think we've had a few 16-year-olds, we've had more than a few 18-year-olds, but I'd say by far and away, they're 20 and 30-year-olds that come to us for treatment. Still, many of their parents are very involved, and they're actually facilitating this because their 20-year-old heroin using son or daughter is somewhat ambivalent sometimes about whether or not they want to be in treatment or not. I mean, literally on an hour-to-hour basis, somebody will go from wanting help to no, I'm just going to go get high again, and you've missed your window of opportunity.
Right.
So we don't see a lot of kids, but again, earlier on we said that something like 10% of kids are actually in treatment. And when I say kids, I mean adolescents. So
right. So let's go into the, the discussion around marijuana and cannabis use a little bit more. I know it's legalized in a lot of states. What are some of the stats that you can share with us? Because I think that's probably, alcohol and cannabis use is probably the entryway for a lot of junior high and high school kids to start, testing the waters or experimenting, as you said earlier.
Yeah, so alcohol and tobacco were kind of always the big sort of gateway drugs, and alcohol in particular has a lot of evidence to show that once you start drinking, you start doing, your willingness to experiment with a lot of other things goes up dramatically. But what's new now is that with the legalization of cannabis and THC products, and when I say legalization, I mean on a state level, it's still federally not legal, but states have legalized it. And so we have data from states like Washington and Colorado who were some of the front runners in legalizing this, and it's all bad. Like, there is not one piece of good data to support a possible benefit in terms of adolescents. So I mentioned already how many 12th graders use it. So in the state of Washington, shortly after legalization, motor vehicle deaths involving THC positive individuals more than doubled. It went from 8% to 17%. A THC positive individual is somewhere between 3 and 7 times more likely to be involved in an MVA, a motor vehicle accident, where they are at fault. And something that people don't talk a lot about is often alcohol and THC are used in combination. So that's like double the impairment. And so the numbers that are coming in with regards to deaths associated with driving from THC are really, really severe. Then the industry, as I've already talked about, is marketing to kids all the time, and so that's a problem, and the perceived risk is going down. But some of the things that aren't readily talked about is that there is a substantial correlation between using marijuana and developing a mood disorder. So depression and anxiety are top of the list. Insomnia is absolutely something that results from habitual cannabis use. People say, well, I need it to sleep. Well, if you need it to sleep, that means that the more reliant you become on it to sleep, the more you're going to need it to sleep, and the more it's going to become like necessary in higher and higher quantities for you to sleep. And then what happens if you take it away? Well, you have massive insomnia. And if you have insomnia, then all of these other mood disorders get worse, right? Stress, anxiety, aggression, they all go up when you don't have proper sleep. And so cannabis and alcohol are profound sleep disruptors. Something else is schizophrenia. When the developing brain that's exposed to high concentrations of THC has a 2 to 3x increased likelihood of developing a psychotic break and then long-term schizophrenia. So they are now showing that there's a causal link. Before they were just correlated, and now they're increasingly showing that, hey, the earlier you use marijuana and the more of it, the more likely you are to develop schizophrenia. I mean, if that doesn't scare parents more than anything, I'm not doing my job.
Wow. And then there are some other things, though, as parents that we should be looking out for, right? Like ADHD. What data do we have around that?
Okay, so substance use disorder, and this is another important take home here, is in adults and kids is highly, highly correlated with co-occurring or coexisting mental health disorders. So depression, anxiety, ADHD, and the number one mental health disorder associated with a substance use disorder is bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is about a 9x increased likelihood of developing a substance use disorder. So with regards to ADHD, there's a lot of confusion because people feel that a lot of the medical community has forced medications onto people that, you know, are A, unneeded, or B, could result in another addiction, right? But the data with regards to ADHD is very, very much strongly in favor of treating it with psychostimulant medications, including Adderall and methylphenidate, which have this sort of bad reputation. But somebody with ADHD who goes untreated is about 3x more likely to develop a substance use disorder, and is definitely associated with having a lower quality of life, less achievement in school, poorer relationships with family and peers. And all of these things can be improved by proper diagnosis and treatment with medications. And there's several studies that have been done that conclusively show that putting a teenager on a psychostimulant medication does not increase their addiction liability or their likelihood of becoming addicted to other drugs later in life. It actually decreases it rather substantially. So,
right, because the reason, like, if you don't, so I'm seeing what you're saying is, if a child has ADHD and we don't medicate them now, or we don't find them treatment now, then they will self-medicate because they're looking for something to help them. Is that right?
Exactly. And they're also going to have a lot more stress in their lives. So they're going to struggle in school. They're going to start to develop, you know, beliefs that they're not smart, that they don't do well, that they're not good achievers. And then so you sort of get a self-fulfilling prophecy of, like, they're not doing well. They believe they're not doing well because they're different and they're not smart. And so they have lower self-esteem. And as we'll talk about here in a minute, self-esteem and motivation and self-reliance are some of the hallmark characteristics of kids that do very well and don't get into drugs and alcohol. So, yeah, I mean, it's like you have to identify and treat underlying mental health disorders, because the prevalence in terms of substance use disorder is extremely high, on the order of 50%. So what I'm basically saying is half the people that have a drug or alcohol problem also have a co-occurring psychiatric issue as well.
Okay. Yeah, and you can see that in kids. They may have anxiety, they have stress, and we just, you know, as, you know, tiger parents, we may be, oh, it's fine, toughen up, you know, and not give them the right tools to really address their stresses or their issues. And then they find ways, they try to find ways to self-medicate, however that looks, whether it's alcohol or
That's
pot
correct.
or alcohol.
Yeah,
All right.
that's spot on.
So then let's move into some of the key takeaways, because we have parents here who are tuned in, who are interested. So I think I know what your answer is, but what are, you know, let's go down the list. What are some of the key takeaways as parents that we should know?
All right, well, I've kind of already pounded on the fentanyl problem and the THC problem. But basically the best solution to this is prevention. And and prevention, there's resources. SAMHSA, SAM, HSA, and NIDA. Those are the two government agencies that have a plethora of resources for parents, as well as links to treatment. But so prevention is the single best thing, right? And prevention applies to even kids that don't have a drug or alcohol problem. They need to undergo the same types of education and awareness that somebody who does develop one have. And so part of this comes, one thing parents can do is when your child goes for their annual pediatrician appointment, ask the pediatrician to do a screening test on them. And these are simply sort of proven tests that have a high correlation with substance use disorder. And one of them is called CRAFT. And so in my opinion, all primary care pediatricians should be asking kids about substance use using these screening modalities that have been verified and sort of like tested over time. So that's one. protective factors associated with kids that do well, kids that are resilient, very important. Fostering and teaching assertiveness in kids is very important. Parent-child bond in a stable home environment. Parents model behaviors, and if a parent is modeling a behavior of abuse, especially when it comes to use of an illicit substance in front of their child, that's an extremely bad thing to be doing. I know those are obvious kinds of things I'm saying. Kids with a high degree of motivation and self-esteem do very well. And one of the biggest things that comes up over and over again is kids should have a pro-social environment. And so social means a lot of communication with parents, a lot of communication with peers, a lot of communication with community groups like churches and organizations. If your kid is an introvert, that's okay. Good solid friendships and good solid relationships with parents will go a long way. Isolation, low self-esteem, feeling that they aren't effective. These are all things that are associated with higher likelihood of trying and getting addicted to drugs.
Mm. And that's particularly scary right now during this quarantine time, right? Where kids are a little more isolated. Maybe we're loosening up a little bit here, but that's, something to be concerned or just to pay close attention to, even if they can just FaceTime with their friends and, whatever it is that they may do to keep in touch with their peer group, right?
Yeah, I was on another exactly the same web meeting like this morning for a group that was that was the topic of conversation. What's happening to people during periods of quarantine? And the number one thing that's happening for our patient population is they're relapsing. And the reason they're relapsing is because of isolation, because they're not connected socially, because of they're early in their recovery, and what they depend on are having these social engagements and these support through social engagements, and that's all been cut off for them. And then it's compounded by the fact that there's uncertainty, there's fear, there's anxiety, and it's kind of the perfect storm where all of a sudden you have a lot of cravings again and you start medicating again. And people who aren't even my patients, or don't have a substance use disorder that's diagnosable, are abusing alcohol and substances in much greater quantities right now. Alcohol sales in the United States are up 55% in the last couple months. And when people are bored and they're stressed and they're not in their healthy routines, they tend to start drinking earlier in the day or using marijuana earlier in the day, and things can get out of control.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm going to dive into a couple of the questions now, if that's okay. You ready? Some questions from the audience. All right. Hi, I was wondering about how dopamine in a synthetic form is compared to dopamine in the brain by natural production. So for example, athletes who train 10 to 12 hours a day and become addicted to natural dopamine, if it has the same effect on the brain as synthetic.
So I don't know what's really meant by synthetic. I mean, dopamine is a molecule that exerts different kinds of effects depending on where it is in your body. So like, we use dopamine as a vasopressor, for example, with intravenous administration for heart cases, like when we're doing cardiac cases, because it increases heart contractility. There are dopamine receptors on the heart. So that's synthetic. Synthetic dopamine in the brain, well, there are certain medications for like Alzheimer's, for example, that have dopamine, and Parkinson's, but when you take them, they go all over your brain. What makes treating addiction so hard with medicines is that there are parts of the brain where dopamine does one thing and parts of the brain where dopamine does something else. But in terms of athletics, that's a way, and exercise, that is a way to produce a lot of natural dopamine in your brain. And one of the things we're always working on in recovery with our patients is we got to talk to them about what are healthy, natural ways to produce higher levels of dopamine in your brain that you were hijacked by using drugs. And they may not be as exciting as using drugs in many cases, or they might not produce as much dopamine in your brain, but they're very, very important to your happiness, your motivation, and your recovery. And so we talk all the time about doing healthy things that produce dopamine in your brain. but that's not synthetic. That's still endogenous dopamine that you're creating.
Right. I think the synthetic dopamine was in the use, or it was the reference was to opioids. So can you get the same high, I guess, from exercise as you would from an opioid? And I think your answer is yes, because in recovery, you're encouraging to create the natural dopamine, right?
Yeah. So when you first start, so what those drugs do is they just cause a massive release of your own dopamine. They don't they don't create fake dopamine in your brain. They just cause your brain to release all of its own dopamine. And when you initially start using drugs, especially opiates and methamphetamine, the amount of dopamine that's being released is like way higher than the amount that you naturally produce, even when you're in your happiest of places, right? We're talking 10x the amount of dopamine. And so compared to like your very best day and all the things you like best and things that are reinforcing like food and sex and things like that, it just blows it away. It's like just so much more. But however, very quickly, your brain will compensate. And pretty soon you're way below the normal level of dopamine. And you're using drugs and alcohol in an effort just to try to get back closer to normal. So it changes very quickly. But yes, ultimately you have to engage in behaviors that create more natural dopamine production.
Okay. All right. Another question is, how much of this has to do with the reformulation of time release in Oxy? We used to hear about the addicts figured out that physically crushing the pills would break down the time release, thus instant rush,
That's right.
etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's addictive with that time release or not, but it's really addictive when you crush it, snort it, and inject it. So that's what everybody was doing, and then they tried to reformulate it to make it tamper-proof, but people found ways to abuse it anyway. And then heroin came along in cheap and big quantities, and a lot of Oxy users pivoted to heroin use.
Okay. Let's see. Is this a question? Let me just read through this. All right. My son has had his 4th relapse recently, all within 2 to 3 weeks after being tapered off of Suboxone. If an individual has been addicted to Xanax and most recently Oxy and fentanyl, how long would someone typically remain on a medically assisted treatment? His fentanyl usage has resulted in 2 ER visits, and doctor said he was in minutes of death.
Yeah, that's spot on. I mean, there you have it in a nutshell. So why he tapered off his Suboxone, I'm not sure. The answer to that question is indefinitely. He needs, I think it's a he, right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, I mean, somebody put him on this for a good reason. It stabilized his brain chemistry, and then attempts to wean him off have resulted in relapses, not just probably of his drug of choice, but across a wide range of drugs. And so the important thing to know here is that when you're on maintenance medication with buprenorphine, which is Suboxone, the goal is to be on it as long as it takes for you to create a solid foundation in your life where you're hitting on all cylinders, where you have you have a job, you have a car, you have a place to live, you have stable social relationships, you're in upwardly mobile before you even have a conversation about tapering off. Because it's like a 300-pound diabetic saying, I think I'm ready to get off my diabetes now, but I haven't really changed any of my eating habits. It's not a good idea. It's going to fail.
Right. Yikes. That's super scary. I mean, it's so real. So, all right. How about, and this is just related to pain relief, like if you've had your wisdom teeth pulled, what's appropriate dosage for an adolescent? I mean, I'm guessing that depends on the patient, right? I mean, that's hard to say.
Real quick, back to the last thing. By the way, there are now injectable forms of buprenorphine that are incredibly effective, and you get them once a month, and so you don't get into these problems nearly as much. With regards to the second question, I don't know. As far as the dose for an adolescent, the answer is less, if any. I mean, more often than not, Tylenol and ibuprofen are going to provide better pain relief than an opiate would anyway. if you need an opiate, it should be the minimum effective dose for the shortest period of time, and then that medication should be destroyed after that. But increasingly, we're just put a bunch of local anesthetic in there, and you put people on round-the-clock Tylenol interspersed with round-the-clock ibuprofen. You probably get 80% of the pain relief with zero of the euphoria.
Right, right. Okay, last question, and then we're going to wrap this up. How do employers, and do you know this answer, how do employers interpret drug test results for MAT?
Oh, that's a tough question. It depends on what employer. So the federally mandated drug screening tests don't include buprenorphine as one of their drugs on the panel. If an employer basically tests you and says, I'm not hiring you because you're on buprenorphine, and you say to that employer, I'm legally prescribed this buprenorphine by my physician or by my nurse practitioner, and they don't hire you, that's discrimination. Okay, this is no longer a conversation has to do with, oh, you're on buprenorphine and that's trading one drug for another. No, this is a highly effective drug that prevents you from relapsing and dying. And it's all of the major national authorities, SAMHSA, NIDA, MIAAA, ASAM, they all say that this is standard of care, this is evidence, and the World Health Organization agrees, and they use it in Europe. So it's, to me, that employer has a problem with their understanding and or they're being discriminated.
Okay. Well, thank you. That wraps up our hour. That went so quickly. Thank you so much, Dr. Dahimi.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you to all of our friends and new friends who checked in today and were tuning in. Thank you guys so much. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to shoot them over and we can share whatever information. We actually have some resources here. So some of the books that we recommend or that Dr. Dahimi recommends, one is called Dreamland and the other one is called Dope Sick. And then there's a lot of other information that we'd be happy to share. So if you'd like to get that information, please send me a message in the chat or send me an email privately if you know me personally. Thank you guys so much. Thank you.
And if you guys want questions about our clinic, it's www.mymatclinic.com, and we'd be happy to answer questions. And there's some links to these resources on our resources page.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye.
All right. Bye.